we look at it in a certain light, Latin America is a kind of ideological pendulum bridging opposite poles. From the military dictatorships of the 70s and 80s, to the transition to democracy, the flood of economic liberalization of the 90s, to the all-powerful statism of the so-called socialism of the 21st century. You could almost say that in Latin America, everything is either black or white. The assault in Brasilia in early 2023 by Bolsonaro supporters on Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Palácio Palace, which is the seat of the presidency, was just the latest example of this kind of passionate fury that is so often difficult to make compatible with democracy. A fury, what's more, that is always dominated by certain common parameters that I think we all know perfectly well. What if in some way, and despite recent events, this pendulum is really beginning to swing? Could Latin America be at an ideological turning point? Let's find out. The first 10 years of the 21st century saw practically the entire region plunging into what various political analysts called the red tide. In March 2005, for example, it was estimated that 75% of Latin America's 350 million inhabitants were governed by leftist parties. At that time, we can remember Hugo Chavez, Daniel Ortega, Lula da Silva, Rafael Correa, Evo Morales, and the Kirchner family, making many reforms, both economic and social, to get closer to socialism and to nourish the state with more and more interventionist tools. And keep in mind, I'm not only talking about the economic field. What happened in Caracas and Managua, where you know all too well, went far beyond the public accounts.
Desde Ecuador, decía Bolívar, o nos unimos de verdad, o un nuevo coloniaje legaremos a la posteridad. El Banco del Sur, la Telesur, una televisora del sur, una Petrosur, la unidad energética del sur.
Not to mention the assault on democracy itself. In that maelstrom of socialist enthusiasm, multilateral platforms were generated, such as the Union of the South American Nations, UNASUR, the Community of Latin America and the Caribbean States, CELAC, and the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, ALBA. Come on, the process seems to be unstoppable. But let's pause a moment, because with corruption and the popular vote, in those places where it was respected, of course, the waves of these immense red tides began to break, one by one. Look at this.
Macri wins in Argentina and puts an end to Kirchnerism after 12 years. Venezuelan opposition wins largest number of seats and will control the National Assembly. Impeachment. Dilma Rousseff is impeached as president of Brazil. Lenin Moreno blocks Rafael Correa. Ecuador votes in referendum in favor of limiting presidential terms to 2 terms. Bolsonaro is elected president of Brazil.
As you can see, the turn that the region has taken since 2015 generated a scenario totally contrary to the red tide, whose forces were greatly weakened, although not defeated. The victory of López Obrador in Mexico, followed by the defeat of Mauricio Macri in 2019, along with the social uprisings in Chile and the return of Evo Morales' party to power in Bolivia in 2020, kicked the Latin American political chessboard once again. But was the succession of events really a remake of the red tide? Well, let's take a look.
The debacle of political change.
In July 2018, when 53.19% of Mexicans delivered Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, to the presidency, it not only broke the dominance of the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which had only briefly eroded by the PAN, the National Action Party, in the country, but it also gave the first soundings of the coming change. Although AMLO had to exist as a lone wolf for a while, accompanied by dissident presidents of socialism such as Piñera in Chile, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duque in Colombia, and Macri in Argentina, the social outbursts in Chile and Ecuador in 2019 would end up opening a real Pandora's box in the region.
A todos los chilenos, ellos están en guerra contra todos los chilenos de buena voluntad que queremos vivir en democracia, con libertad y en paz.
The wave of riots in Santiago, which ended up even provoking the start of a process to change the constitution, was possibly a tremendously traumatic shock for the countries opposed to the red tide. Up to that moment, the Chilean model has served an example of stability and growth thanks to its more market-oriented policies. However, following the riots, that idea, that model, began to cease to be an objective and became a myth with a high political cost. Yes, that was the result. Who would want to replicate such a model? And you know what? It was just then when, from Caracas, the melancholic custodians of the so-called 21st century socialism began to predict an ideological hurricane that would once again position the left at the top of political power.
Está soplando una brisa bolivariana. Está soplando una brisa bolivariana. que va a venir desde el Río Grande y un poquito más arriba hasta la Patagonia, brisa bolivariana, brisa de los pueblos libertarios.
However, the truth is that at this time, the story played out very differently, at least very different from what the Maduros, Chavez and company had in mind. Those outbreaks of violence did not make society demand the return of the role models and custodians of the red tide, but rather generated results, somewhat watered down. Support for neither one nor the other. Listen up.
A fading red.
If we look at the trend of the most prominent governments in Latin America in 2019, we can see that the left has been decimated from the political map of the region, except for a few specific cases such as Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. However, some 3 years later, the Bolivarian breeze seems to have done its job with changes as striking as those that have taken place in the bastions of Latin American center-right, such as Colombia. If we take into account the map, well, it seems quite clear. We could say that the red tide is back, that the socialism of the 21st century has taken power again. Once again, the Bolivarian revolution is setting the music to follow, right? Well, the truth is, actually, that it's not. Yes, it is true. The leftist parties, sometimes parties and movements closely linked to the old Bolivarian Guard, have once again taken power. However, wait a minute, because the truth is that the profile of most of the current leaders seems very far from what Chavez, Castro, Ortega and company would have argued for back in their day. You don't believe me? We'll take a look.
Por 104 votos a favor, 18 en contra y 24 abstenciones, la Cámara aprobó una resolución promovida por representantes de la UDI que respalda las declaraciones del presidente Gabriel Boric respecto de los regímenes dictatoriales de Venezuela, Nicaragua y Cuba.
De que yo soy
¿Qué siente de que lo comparen con Hugo
Chavez,
Chávez?
Pues que es una calumnia, eso sí.
Chávez, digamos, hizo una promesa a su sociedad, digamos una distribución social de la renta petrolera, que es de lo que viven los venezolanos. El pueblo votó por él varias veces, pero la promesa quedó incumplida. ¿En qué sentido? En que realmente no se puede construir una equidad social, una justicia social, en una economía que solo extrae petróleo.
Uma coisa, eu gostaria de desejar para a Venezuela o que eu quero para o Brasil. Sabe, eu quero que as eleições sejam sempre mais livres, sejam menos, que se acate o resultado.
With Argentine support, the UN again condemns the Maduro regime in Venezuela.
That is to say, the region turned to the left. That is undeniable. However, the left seems somewhat different from the one that played a leading role at the beginning of the century. It doesn't seem far from that revolutionary left that was in love with Hugo Chavez's long speeches. The new governments embody something that a kind of diluted Latin American socialism, perhaps even a kind of Latin social democracy. And what can I say? We may like these political currents more or less, but I don't think there is much doubt that they seem much better in all aspects than the revolutionary movements of the beginning of the century. In general, the new governments do not talk about revolutions, expropriations, nationalizations and the like. And that seems to be an advance because in the long run, it could generate much more stability. Let me make it clear, whether you like their policies or you don't, the change of cards seems much less radical. Even Lula has won the elections in Brazil with an electoral ticket that has Geraldo Alckmin as his running mate, an icon of the Brazilian centre-right and a former electoral opponent of Lula himself. Perhaps in some ways, Pedro is still partly the only exception. He seems to be too comfortable with tyrants like Maduro, but even in Colombia, the political reality under Petro is a far cry from what most Latin American leftist movements were during the early 21st century. And the question is, why this sudden change? Is it a generational issue? Is it the result of self-criticism of the part of Latin American left? Is it because they want to emulate European countries maybe? Well, maybe. It's a little bit of everything. Of course, another factor that may have contributed to the loss of influence is perhaps financial. Yes, you heard me correctly. Check this out.
No one can afford the party anymore.
It seems, VisualPolitik viewers, that the red tide at the beginning of the cycle had an epicenter, Caracas. From the Venezuelan capital, Hugo Chavez positioned himself as a political but also financial model, especially for all the adventurers of the time. Take a look.
Evo Morales joins Chavez' anti-neoliberal and anti-imperialist project in his visit to Venezuela. One of the agreements signed will be the $30 million that Chavez has committed to deliver to Bolivia for social works, besides supplying all the fuel that Bolivia consumes. Venezuela enjoys its oil bonanza. Experts believe that President Chavez has spent some $5 billion in energy ventures outside Venezuela, including new or jointly operated oil refineries in Cuba, Uruguay, and Brazil. Venezuela continues to hoard Argentine debt. Ecuador accepts donation of 6 fighter jets from Venezuela. Venezuela officializes crude oil supply agreements Bolivia, Haiti, and Nicaragua. Venezuela officialized 3 direct crude oil supply agreements for a total of 1.48 million barrels per month to Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Haiti, under special payment conditions that include interest of 2% per annum.
You see, the credit card was making payments here and there like there was no tomorrow. And of course, it also financed all kinds of very radicalized left-wing political movements. All of this helped to bring together a pulpit of governments around that utopian project of the Great Motherland. Or better, the Great Wallet. But if all this was happening officially, under the table, it is estimated that Chavez's assistance to its allies was more complex. The most emblematic case would be that of Antonio Wilson, who admitted, after being captured in Buenos Aires, to having taken about $800,000 from PDVSA to finance Cristina Kirchner's campaign in 2007.
¿Era el dinero? Otra vez le preguntó.
El dinero era de PDVSA, de Venezuela.
¿Y hacia dónde iba el dinero?
El dinero iba para la campaña presidencial de la actual presidente Cristina Kirchner.
And of course, if the party was free, why not join in? This is what many political leaders in the first, second, and third rows of the region may have thought. Now, they have changed their jackets. Besides, it is clear that those who took the money and bought the drinks were the most popular in the class. Today, however, things are completely different. Today, Venezuela is practically bankrupt, with no possibility of economically supporting any significant political project. The collapse of public accounts as a result of the compulsive nationalization of private industries and the lack of investment in oil infrastructure has made Venezuela unable to extract even its own oil. And we're talking about a country that has the largest reserves of conventional crude oil in the world. This is a major fail we're talking about. And that was in 2019, because in 2022, they have barely managed to produce around 700,000 barrels per day. Of course, when your coffers are full, you can indulge in all kinds of whims, but when they are empty, that's another story. But let's move on.
An increasingly limited left.
If we go back to the political map of 2022, it is evident that the political signposts have changed. The players that have come to power are somewhat different, or at least have changed with respect to what was the norm in the first decade of the 21st century. Now, they maintain more moderate rhetoric and do not hesitate to raise the flag of the third way, which, let me stress, does not mean that the political project is attractive to us. That will depend on each individual case. The defeat of the referendum of the new constitution in Chile, the victory of La Calle Pou's reforms, the change of political leaning that seems to be approaching in Argentina. The new leaders of the left, or center-left, are not only enjoying a golden era, but in many cases are losing many of their major political battles. And that is despite having moderated along the way. And that is why we say the historical pendulum of Latin American politics may have broken. Of course, it may be that thinking of Latin America as a left-right function may be a bit old-fashioned. In recent years, the region seems to have moved towards a more populist, anti-populist dynamic, in view of the failure of Cristina Fernandez, Evo Morales, and Rafael Correa's personalism. Be that as it may, perhaps because of all this, the wave is no longer strictly red, but a little pinker. And in any case, 2023 comes with a very busy agenda for identifying what will be the new political pendulum that will set the pace in the region. Guillermo Lasso will face a referendum in February, in which he will present the main policies to the popular vote, seeking, in the style of La Calle Pou, to empower his management for the remainder of the term. Guatemala, Paraguay, and Argentina will have to renew their executives, while Petro will have its first electoral test as president in October's regional elections. Then, the fierce internal struggle of the ruling party in Bolivia and the institutional crisis in Peru raise questions about the future of these nations, while the development of Lula's government in Brazil will be key to understanding where the Latin American left is heading. Is it getting pinker and pinker? Whether you like this type of movement or not, I think the vast majority of us can agree that it would be good news, especially if we take into account the history of this region. Of course, it's Latin America, so you never know. But at this point, it's all over to you. What do you think about the pink wave currently affecting the region? Do you think that the 21st century socialism project has already been discarded, or could it re-emerge? Is the Latin American left renewing itself, or are they just keeping up appearances? Leave us your comments below and let's open a respectful debate. Of course, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to all of us here at VisualPolitik. Thank you very much once again for watching, all the best, and I'll see you next time.